So the one thing that is not my favorite, far from my favorite, is printers. And most people that I know in IT hate printers too, but they're a huge part of the things that we interact with in a business environment, and you have to know how to install them, configure them, and maintain them when things go wrong, which seems to be pretty often when we have a lot of people sending all of their crazy documents to our printer. There are different kinds of printers in different environments, and we're going to talk about what all these different kind of printers are. Now, you're probably used to the one that you used to have at home, but don't even bother with anymore because we've moved away from paper in smaller environments. But commercial printers are still the leading issue and headache for some of our people in IT. Now, are printers all that bad? No. They serve a great purpose in making sure that we have the ability to turn our digital data into paper, ink, things that we can read and physically mark and pass along. So let's take a moment and look at all this good printer stuff. All right, so there are, like I said, different types of printers, and we need to be able to install them, configure them, and maintain them. And when they break, we have to troubleshoot them. So the first thing I want to ask is, what does a printer do? Exactly. Well, it's literally any device that produces text or image from electronic content onto paper. And there's different kinds of papers, like photo paper, legal size paper, which is still normal paper, but a non-standard size. And we can even print on stickers and make labels or really cool little gifts and things. So it's still one of the most popular peripheral devices in office environments in these days. And we're going to take a look at all different kinds of printers. Now you see quite a few on your screen now, some of which look familiar to you, and if you're younger, some of which look a little foreign. So don't worry, these are all pretty simple, but the first thing I want to talk about are the actual components. So any printer are going to have these components within them. They're going to have some type of mechanism to transfer their ink or their heat or whatever they use to create the text or images. They're going to have a mechanism for getting that onto a piece of quote unquote paper or whatever the deliverable is. They're also going to have a paper feed of some sort because as they produce the ink or, excuse me, as they produce the text or the image, they're going to need to feed that forward and get to the next part of the paper. Now, they're going to be connected to a device of some sort, so a computer or whatever's sending the data. Now, that might be through a wired connection. They might be just on the network per se, which still means they're probably wired, but we do have wireless printers as well. And we have some printers that you can connect through in different wireless ways, so we'll talk about that. And all of them are going to have paper input, which is just where we put the stack of paper or roll of paper or whatever it is that it uses to get, again, the text and images on the sheet. So when we talk about, let me make sure I got it all. Awesome. So when we talk about an AIO, which is an all-in-one, one of the most popular acronyms that's pretty much an umbrella acronym, to be honest, is calling everything in IT that does more than one thing an MFD, or a multi-function device. Now, AIO is an all-in-one, and we usually keep that just for printers because an all-in-one printer is a pretty popular as far as terminology. But MFD is really the main acronym that covers any single device that does more than one service. Multi-function device, MFD. Soho is a small office, home office. So that's actually one that's used pretty often. Well, you may have heard me say it before, but as we go through some chapters for components in different areas, you'll definitely hear me refer to Soho, small office, home office. So before I move on to the next section, I want to ask you a question. What do we need to make sure is updated in all of our printers, especially if something goes wrong? Where do we start troubleshooting? Now think on the OSI model from the top-down method, not necessarily bottom-up here. If you were going bottom-up, you would talk about, is it plugged in, right? Is the power cable plugged in? Is the network cable plugged in? Those are layer 1 questions. But I want you to think of, I want you to think of the top, so the application layer, layer 7. What are some things that we may need to update or make sure are in place before we expect our printer to work correctly? Well, if this whole time you've been thinking of drivers, you are correct. Every piece of hardware, all devices have drivers, and printers are no different. And printers are actually one of the most particular in regards to needing their drivers updated, and they may need to be updated often. So don't forget about drivers. If for any reason you had said firmware, well, you are correct as well. That is one of the things that enables you to configure all of your functions, be able to monitor and manage your print jobs. So the firmware is going to really be important in the IT side for us, because we want to be able to run diagnostic tests and be able to test the device via the device, meaning we want to go to the printer and be able to print a test page and make sure that it's working correctly, as well as sit in front of a computer and send over print jobs per se, so that we can ensure that it's working correctly. And all of that is dependent on the firmware. All right, so let's move on now to laser printers. Now this is the one that I have to admit is going to be the favorite on your test. They're going to ask you some questions about laser printers and networked printers, and more specifically, networked laser printers. So jump into this process via the slides. Definitely take the time to review it in your book. This is going to be an important one. Now, laser printers use a laser beam to form images and get the toner to print those images on a piece of paper. They can print on all different kinds of paper. Now, there are different components. There's a toner cartridge itself, which is really what we think of as the ink. It's actually toner. And there's the laser itself, which is how it charges the drum. And I'll talk about that process that you're looking at here in just a second. You're going to have a high voltage power supply to be able to convert the supplied current to pretty much the optimal current for specific components. So it's what makes it work as far as getting that laser to do its thing. You have the paper transport mechanism, so each piece of paper can feed through properly. The major part of this that you see in the center is what's called an EP drum, electrostatic photographic drum, aka the imaging drum is what you'll see or hear most people call it. So this is literally what carries the electrical charge that attracts the toner or the ink, and then it transfers that toner to the paper. So after that, you have the corona assembly, and that's where it's the component that contains the corona wires, and it pretty much charges the paper so that it can pull the ink off of the drum onto the paper. And again, I'm going to go through this process with you in a little bit more detail here in a second, so it'll all make sense. Now, after our corona assembly, you have the fuser assembly, and I just call it the fuser. It applies pressure and heat to the paper so that those loose toner particles, aka the ink, will actually bond and stick to the paper itself. If this wasn't there, when we took the paper out of the printer, all of this little colored dust would just fly off the paper. So the fuser is what gets it to attach. The very last piece is what's called a formatter board, and this is just what exposes and processes all the data received from the computer and coordinates all the different steps to this. So that's not necessarily a piece of the printing process as far as the transfer of paper and ink, but it helps make it all happen. So you've been looking at this laser print process here for a minute, and I'm going to take you through a few steps, 7 of them to be exact. Now, if you need to put your finger on the screen and find this piece and start going around in the order so you can see how this works, feel free. You're by yourself probably at home or at work. I need you to know how this works, so get familiar with it. The first step is cleaning. There's going to be a rubber squeegee blade that touches your EP drum, and it's going to clean all of the residue and leftover toner from the last go around. So that's per se where we're going to start with this process and then go around the drum. The next process is erasing. It actually takes the charges away from the EP drum so it can prep for the next image. You don't want any leftover electronic charging to be there, and if it is, it'll completely mess up the next image or text for the next piece of paper. The third step is called charging. This is where the imaging drum is prepared by charging it with the thing called a charge roller. So the roller is connected to that high voltage power supply unit that we talked about, and it actually produces a negative charge. It produces up to negative 600 volts on the surface of the drum. And it's a really finely tuned laser beam, so you see it there at the top of the image. And that has positively charged particles, or a positive charge. And it casts onto the negatively charged drum, and that's what transfers the text or the image so that the toner or ink knows where to stick. So that's pretty much the first version of our image or our text that will be transferred. So the next step is what is called writing. This is actually the process of the laser beam writing to the EP drum. So I just talked about how the charging is the negative 600 volts. The writing is where the laser actually writes that image or text onto the drum. Step 5 is developing. So this is where the toner is actually attracted to the areas that were hit by the laser beam. So this is where that fine dust that will end up looking like ink to us will actually attach itself to the drum, and it'll only attach itself to where the laser hit. So it's pretty much an invisible image when the laser is there, and inside the toner cartridge, a really thin layer of toner is applied to the surface. And the super thin blade, it's called a white blade, spreads the toner evenly on the surface of the drum, and honestly, it only leaves behind the toner in the regions that were written on by the laser beam. So you now have your image, but it's not on paper yet. Step 6 is transferring. This is when your positively charged paper is fed into the printer by pickup rollers, and it attracts all that negatively charged toner. Now the toner has been sticking to the drum this whole time, but now it's transferred onto the paper, and it's only bound at this point by the charges. So we still need to get it to stick to the paper. And that's the final step. Step 7 is called fusing. And that's the final stage where the toner is literally melted and pressed with pressure against the paper. And this creates a permanent bond. Now there are 2 transfer rollers, and they're really, really close to each other. So close that when you put a piece of paper between them, it feels the pressure. Now there's a heating roller, which is the top one, and it creates heat inside. And it's also coated with a non-stick material to make sure that none of the toner gets stuck on it. And then the bottom one is a pressure roller, and it presses the piece of paper against the heating roller, and that's what allows it to melt and fuse that toner with the paper. So once that process is complete, it's going to kick the paper out, and your print job is done. All your text and images will be on the paper. Now, there are some steps to that process that you probably had no idea. So if you need to go through that again, please do. I need you to be comfortable with that process, as well as the troubleshooting process for laser printers, which we'll get to at the end. But we have other types of printers to take a look at. And one of the most popular, especially for that Soho environment, and you may have had as a kid or when you were younger at home, is an inkjet printer. Now, it forms images on paper by literally spraying liquid ink out of its ink cartridge, and it has nozzles, and it just aims the nozzles where it needs to go on the paper. The cool thing about this, and what you need to know about the unique part of an inkjet printer, is it had a self-cleaning cycle, and its print head would be parked on the side of this moving ribbon when it's not in use. So there's 2 different ways that it can actually get the ink out, and that's by either heat or vibration. And both of those got pretty popular with different manufacturers. So there's a process here as well, and it's good to know the process, but you need to understand that the laser printer process is the most important for your exam and for your real life in enterprise environments. But nonetheless, I'll take you through the 4 steps. First is preparation. So this is literally when the print process is initiated, the motor or belt starts moving across the printer, and all the gears are starting to advance the paper, meaning that the paper enters the printer to be printed on. And the second step is ink dispersion. So the print head will move across the paper and release the ink, again, either by heat or vibration, and carefully aim that ink to where it goes on the paper. Ink deposit is when the print head is moving back and forth, printing one row of the image at a time. So you probably remember that print head going back and forth across, and that process is called ink deposit. And the last part of this, of course, is your paper advance. So as every one of those rows is printed, meaning the ink has been deposited on the paper, then the paper will advance so that the next row can be reached. And when it's done printing, it'll come out. So inkjet printers can print on almost anything. Really cheap paper as far as just copier paper that you buy in bulk, photo paper. They had brighter paper that was actually specifically made for inkjet printers. You can print labels and you can print on envelopes, anything you really want. The one thing to remember here is that inkjet printers had different cartridges of liquid ink. And there's nothing worse than putting the magenta cartridge in the yellow space and having a really messed up color image that comes out on your paper. So remember, as far as an inkjet process, that you make sure that you have the right color cartridges in the right place. Now, there's one type of printer that you interact with more than you probably realize. When is the last time you went to the store and bought something? What do they hand you at the end of your transaction? Well, in that case, you've used a thermal printer, and the thing you got was probably a receipt. This is any printer, as far as a thermal printer, that uses a heating element to create an image or text on the paper. And there's a few different types of paper, but for the most part, we're looking at receipts. And let me take you to the process, of course. So there are just a few steps in this process, and it's pretty straightforward, where you're going to have a roll of paper, but this is special paper because, again, we get the image or text on there with heat, not necessarily ink. And you load the paper in, making sure, of course, that it is in the right direction. So this is where we usually joke about toilet paper. There is a right and wrong way to put toilet paper on the roll, and there is a right and wrong way to put thermal paper into the printer. But once you have it in there the right direction and you pull it through the thermal print head, as far as getting the piece of paper to come out of the printer, like you've seen cash registers have to change their roll of paper, then the paper will progress past a thermal print head and it will apply heat, and that's how the image or text is created. Pretty simple stuff, not really difficult to do. They've been around for what seems like ever, and well, they're going to be here for a really long time. So I want to spend just a moment here on some specialized thermal printers that 90% of you will never come across, but you should know that they exist. Thermal paper and thermal printers are capable of creating some really cool color images. Now, these are not your normal receipt printers that you see in your big retail stores, but they have thermal wax printers that can transfer melted wax onto the paper. And it can be used in office settings, but it can produce some really cool color copies or color prints in a decent quality considering it's thermal. Now, there's also this thing called a thermal dye transfer printer. This is probably the most sophisticated version, and this is what's used to create kind of those higher end or higher resolution color photographic printing via thermal. So again, not something you'll come across every day, but know that it's capable of doing more than you thought. Now, one of the older versions of printing is impact. Impact printers do still exist. For those of you who thought they had died forever, I'm sorry, they are still here. So, what in the world is a dot matrix printer or an impact printer? So, any type of printer that strikes a component against an ink ribbon and then that strikes against the paper is an impact printer. So our first version, or what I want you to think about if you're not familiar with these, is a typewriter. But the difference here is that there's an ink ribbon between the actual print head that strikes the paper and the paper itself. So very, very much so like a typewriter, but you have to include an ink ribbon. Now these are incredibly slow and noisy printers in comparison to what we have now, but we still use them pretty much in any environment where we use carbon copies. So if you go to an auto parts store, or if you go get your oil changed and you get the pink copy and they keep the white copy and the yellow copy or whatever that looks like, it was probably printed on a impact printer of some sort. And the most popular one, and I already said it, is a dot matrix printer. And I kind of just always think of that when I see impact printers. So this was a specific type of printer that used different dots to create the letters. Now, it's not the only kind of impact printer, but it was very, very popular. It had, how do I say this? And maybe I should pull up a picture. So let me work on that while I talk to you about it. You actually use dots to create the image of text. So instead of having a full character, you'll have little dots that are created. And I'm going to try and pull up a picture of what that might look like. So let me pull up an image here. Oh, this one is perfect. All right, so on your screen, you have an example of a dot matrix printer with text. So you'll actually see here that there's just a bunch of little dots that are actually making up these letters, but they have one magnified here as far as the A, and so you can really see those dots, and they just come together to form characters. And that's literally how dot matrix printers worked. They just found the dots to configure into the character that you were looking to print, and this is what it looked like when it came out. And these were used for a very long time and for a wide variety of printing. Mostly characters, not so much images, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. And for any of you that have forgotten, there was special kind of paper that we call tractor fed paper, and it literally looked just like this. And it had these little circles on the end, and this was perforated, meaning that you could tear off the sides really easily, and it had these green and white lines across it. This was quote unquote special paper that we used to print inventory and accounting sheets and all kinds of good stuff. So we've moved away from that, and for those of you who lived through the dot matrix age, you understand how great it is that we had or have now different options. But for those of you who have not seen this before, it was a real thing. And this that you're seeing here is a pretty high quality print job considering I can't see between the dots. So with all that awesomeness, impact printers were an important part of our life and business, and we were really, really thankful for them being there, but we've moved on. So let's spend just a second here on the process and get to what the future of printing looks like. So the impact printer process has just a few steps where your paper will enter, your print head will strike against the paper, it actually strikes against the ink ribbon, and then the ink ribbon makes contact with the paper where the print head struck. And there are two different types of print heads. You can either have the full character print heads or the formed character printers, which means the A is an A, just like a typewriter. But if you have a dot matrix printer, that means the dots will come together and impact the printer to make the character that may look like an A, and so on and so forth for all characters, upper and lower case. That's about it for impact printers. I do want you to remember that special paper that I just showed you. And actually, with that being said, let me not let this escape without showing you one other type of paper because they didn't all have the green and white lines. If you wanted to print on just normal paper, like normal white 8.5 by 11, then this is what your paper looked like. So you'll see here that we've got an 8.5 11 sheet of paper, and again you have those funny little dots on the side that are perforated. And I'll bring up another example here that might help. There you go. So these sheets are actually connected. Let's take a look here. You see how this sheet has a little fold in it, but it's connected to the next sheets of paper? That's because when we bought paper and we put it in the printer, there's a little gear per se that would enter into these holes and it would feed it forward. So pretty cool process, really easy to push paper forward without necessarily having to have pickup rollers like we have today. But when it came out of the printer and you needed to separate all the sheets and take all of those little dots off, you'd end up with a mess that looked kind of like that. And so this was our 8.5 by 11 world for a very long time. And anytime you got your paper out of the printer, it would look just like this. So this would be the blank paper, it would go through the printer, and it would come out in this stack, back and forth and back and forth. And your job, or whoever printed's job, would be to separate these pieces of paper, take all of the edges off, and either staple it or put a 3-hole punch into it and deliver it to wherever it needed to go. So I'm sorry for taking you down that road for any of you that had to live through that professionally for a long time. But for some of our not as familiar with old printer aged participants, it is an important thing for them to know what we had to go through. All right, so virtual printers is where we are now. We are stepping into the 2000s, and when I say virtual printers, I'm talking about PDF and all the things like PDF, but that's the most popular. Now, virtual printing means that there's no paper involved. This is where I'm using a piece of software that's built into my OS or has been installed on top of my OS to create a virtual saved version of any text or images. Now, there's a lot of different reasons you might prefer this over actual paper. Maybe you're sending a document from one computer to another, or you're looking for just a digital secured copy of a document, but you don't actually need it on paper. So PDF, again, is the most popular. XPS is going to be second to that, but there are a lot of different versions that we have. So, like everything else, we have different process, which I thought was that slide, but I guess we'll get there in just a second. But what I want to show you here is when we have our printers listed, it's going to actually be listed as a printer itself in our digital world. So our computer might have a physical printer or more than one of those installed that you can see here in the print menu or the printers and devices menu. But when you have virtual printers installed, you'll see those in the same place because technically they're still printers, they're just not including paper. All right, there's my process. 6 very quick steps of which I am sure you're familiar with. Now, there's more than one way to go through this process, as in right-click, save as, and go, or you can Control P or tell something to print and then print it to a PDF. So there's a lot of ways to do this, but one of the processes and the steps per se, if you need to install the virtual printer, then you'll go ahead and do that. And then you'll open the application and tell it what document you want to virtually print, and you're going to print it. If you need to change the configurations, and we do still have print paper configurations here, that just means it's going to save it in that sizing, not necessarily printed on paper in that sizing. And then you'll save it, or AKA print it, to your place that you want to save it on, either locally or in your cloud or on your external storage, wherever you're looking to save that document. So that is the virtual printing process, and it's really not that bad. You're completely familiar with it, you just probably haven't heard it called virtual printing. So what are all these supplies that we need and the considerations for buying a printer? Well, If you're going to buy a laser printer, then you need to be aware of the fact that at some point you're going to have to buy toner, you're going to have to buy paper, you're going to have to refill all of the parts that are going to run out or things that are per se perishable, right? So whenever you're looking at implementing a new printer, and you may be the person that has to make the decision for what kind of printer, what size printer, and have a budget in front of you, don't just take your entire budget and say, here's the biggest, baddest printer I could find for however many hundreds or thousands of dollars. Remember that toner can be really expensive if you need to buy new ones. And take into consideration, can you refill the cartridges? Can you recycle the cartridges? Are these things that your company even cares about? Make sure that you know that you're going to have to handle those properly. So you may need to ship them back to your manufacturer or whoever you're working with to purchase toner or cartridges. So these are just some of the things that most people forget. Now, ink cartridges were definitely a consideration for cost and should still be if you have an inkjet printer. But we reached the point a few years ago where it was actually less expensive financially to purchase an entirely new printer that came with cartridges than to just buy cartridges themselves. So that's not necessarily the case anymore, but there was an odd time that the pricing was just totally out of whack. So I talked to you about laser printers, and I also talked to you about network printers, and I said that laser networked or networked laser printers are where things go wrong. So let's talk about that for just a moment here. Local printers are something that is physically or wirelessly directly connected to a local computer, meaning that they have an open session or direct connection between your laptop or your PC and the printer. That means you don't necessarily have to go through your network or any type of big controllers per se, because your local computer is going to hold your print queue, which are all the jobs that are waiting. Now, a network-based printer is connected to your network, and this is where you are sharing those print devices or resources, meaning multiple employees or people can print to the same printer. Now, this is managed by the network or a network computer called a print server, and this is where the print server actually holds your print queue, not a local computer. Now, the last one that you see here, a network connected printer, is something that has a built-in network adapter card, and it connects directly to your network, meaning you're going to plug it in via Cat5 or Cat6, or you're going to connect it to your network wirelessly. And all print jobs are then sent over the network via TCP/IP, and they'll have an onboard print server, so they'll have their own customized software, and they'll handle the print queue on the printer side. So it's not required to have an onboard print server, but that is usually the case. If you don't, then you'll still have a network computer that is going to be your print server or act as your print server. So the last two, the network-based and the network-connected printer, is where I want you to focus the most. And I'd have to say, in my experience, the questions that I had come up most often were network-connected printers. And there's all kinds of things that can go wrong with these in regards to basic network connectivity and functionality issues that could happen with a computer too. It needs an IP address, it has a MAC address, and it has its own server inside. So there's some room for error there. So when we talk about print device sharing, that really just means that two or more end users or devices have access to send information to that printer. So it can be wired or wireless, and it can be a combination of those as well. Maybe some users are connected wired, and some of them are through the wireless network. Either way, two or more users that have access to a single printer or print resource. There are some different configuration options that you're probably familiar with and may have had a struggle making work. I know in my time with printers that if the drivers aren't updated, collate can be an absolute mess. But let's talk about these. Duplex literally means printing on both sides of the paper here. So it's going to print on one side, the paper is actually going to re-enter the printer, and the other side will be printed on as well. Now, collate means that if you're printing a multi-page document, instead of printing 20 pages of the first page or 20 copies of the first page, and then 20 copies of the second page, 20 copies of the third page, and then having to put those in page 1, page 2, page 3. Remember making those stacks in grade school where you put all the paper in order? Well, now our printer can do that for us. So it'll print page 1 and then 2 and then 3, and then the next section or the next papers that will come out is 1, 2, and then 3 again, so that when you pick up your final print job, they're in order, even if there's multiple copies, and you won't have to do that manual sorting and configuring yourself. Orientation is referring to portrait versus landscape. So is your paper going to print the taller way or the wider way? And the print quality just means how many dots per inch, or DPI, meaning is this a high-res image or a low-resolution image? This is just how crisp and sharp your image looks. And text, it applies to text as well. Cloud print services have saved my butt so many times. So this is where you can access a printer over the cloud, not necessarily being in your office. So you can send things from your phone, your laptop, your tablet, from wherever you are in the world, and connect to the printer either at home or at work. So usually there's a public printer located in an office, or maybe even if you have an account with an office supply store, meaning that what do they have, like FedEx Kinko's or UPS business type shop, where you can send your print job there and it'll print for you before you get there, so you can just pick it up and go. So being able to access these printers is usually just an app that's provided. So whether it's an app via the printer manufacturer, like Canon or Dell or whoever makes your printer, or an app provided by the store that you're going to use. So either one of those you can install on your mobile device or have the software on your laptop and just send the print job and it will appear in a remote location. Pretty cool stuff. So laser printer maintenance. I told you they would break, and we would definitely come back to that. So what's going to break in a laser printer? First and foremost, take a look at the slide and pick some of your favorite options, because they can all happen. There are so many moving parts in a laser printer, and things get so hot and dirty because of all of that toner and paper dust, that preventative maintenance is appropriate here and a pretty important task. Now, if you have a huge commercial printer, it's actually part of your contract most times that somebody will come in on a monthly basis and clean and service your laser printer. Now, some of the straightforward things, of course, is when your toner cartridge gets low, you replace it. You might have to calibrate the printer. You'll need to do some normal maintenance for your pickup rollers, as far as your paper being able to enter the printer and not pick up 2 pieces at a time, or it has random paper jams. But some of the most important parts here are excess toner and paper dust, because they will build up very quickly in that printer, and it can cause some overheating and ventilation issues. So make sure that, again, cost consideration wise, you are ready for those steps and those tasks when it comes to the laser printer issues or process and maintenance. Now, thermal printers and most of our other printers going forward are pretty straightforward. You need to replace the paper whenever it runs out, and you need to clean whatever the element is that is providing the ink. So for thermal printers, we have a heating element. Remember that this is the type of paper that we use for receipts, and it transfers that image or text via heat. And you can actually use isopropyl alcohol to just clean off any residue from the print heads here. Pretty straightforward. Impact printers, again, just making sure that you have paper for it is always step one. Clean the print heads and replace the ribbon and whenever that's needed. Because of the tractor-fed paper here, you're going to have some print dust inside and outside of the printer. So you'll want to clean that off on a regular basis. Maybe once a week if you're printing a lot, once a month if you're not using it too much. Inkjet printers, again, paper as needed, ink as needed. You will need to calibrate these pretty often per se in comparison to laser printers. And you have this thing called a nozzle test, which is just going to test each of the colors that you have available, make sure that they're aligning correctly and that they're dispersing ink correctly. And if anything's wrong, you can modify via the software that came with it to calibrate the printer itself. So most printers have a pretty common list of things that can go wrong, and so you can actually get a printing maintenance toolkit per se. And the one that you see here is more oriented towards laser printers because, again, that's our favorite in IT, in CompTIA, and in a business environment. So you see something on there called a toner vacuum. Now, this does not mean that you take your vacuum from home and stick it inside your printer and get all the toner dust and paper dust out. This is a special piece of equipment that can be used. It's small, a low-powered vacuum that is meant to remove toner and small paper dust out of really tiny areas in your printer. So please don't think that you can just take your normal vacuum and just stick it in your printer, because this is not how that works. Another thing you'll see here is compressed air. Now, this depends on your environment because compressed air is not always the best option. Do not use compressed air if you have a lot of dust and you are inside. And it's probably not feasible for you to take your printer outside, especially if you have a large commercial size laser printer. You're not going to wheel it out to the back of the building and just blow all the dust out. That's why we have the toner vacuum. But if you have a small printer environment and you need to get out debris from inside of a printer, maybe you have a little piece of paper stuck somewhere, then compressed air can be the right choice to alleviating that problem. There are different tools that we use to troubleshoot on the software side of when things aren't necessarily right in our printer. And one of the most popular ones is just test patterns. We'll tell the printer to print some characters, meaning sentences, or maybe the alphabet in upper and lower case. We'll also tell it to print in dark black, maybe light gray, and if it's a color printer, then we'll have all of the colors print so that we can see what's going on and if anything needs to be adjusted. Now, a printer spooler can be a pretty useful tool, and this is when we want to find out why a print job is faulting or failing, meaning it's not getting to the printer itself. So if a print job is getting through the spooler, then that means that there's probably a hardware issue. But if it's not making it, that means the application that sent it or the device that sent it is probably not connected to the printer. So the spooler is the point at which it makes it from your computer or the device that's sending it to the printer and actually starts to print. So kind of a simple point of either make or break so we can see what side an issue is on. Now, power cycling a device is something you've heard of. You can do this to printers, cell phones, computers. This is turning it off and turning it back on. We've all gone through that with lots of devices. The last one I want to talk about here are general diagnostic utilities, which means the self-diagnostic programs that come with the printer themselves. And this can look at hardware and software issues, and every printer has their own self-diagnostic program. Some of them are more in depth than others, but you also have troubleshooters that are built into your operating system, and they'll do some general troubleshooting to try and figure out what the problem is and some entry-level steps to solve it. Now, what is the best place to look for if you just can't figure out what the problem is? That's always the manufacturer's website. If you're having an issue and you're getting error codes or some type of log and you can't figure out what's going on, take the issue that's being reported and go to the manufacturer website. Most of us do not retain our device documentation, or a lot of devices now come with a single sheet of paper and tell you what the manufacturer's website is for that make and model, and all the information will be there in digital form. But either way, when something goes wrong, I would say head over to the website and start troubleshooting from there. Your software vendor websites are going to be all of the maintenance libraries per se, or all the tech specs that is on a website, and they can usually give you the troubleshooting steps once you tell it what the error code is or what the report back from the printer is. So you take that error message, you plug it into either the software vendor or hardware vendor site, and then you'll get to know what they recommend to troubleshoot it. Now, just like with anything in our computer, IT creates logs. Activities create logs. Everything you do is logged somewhere. So if there's ever an issue with your printer, there is a log of when it was working and when it stopped working. So you can check these logs for previous user reports that had the same issues if those were logged properly on the human side, but you can look into the logs from the printer itself and see maybe if it lost connectivity at some point, or from the user side if they lost connectivity to the printer. So the three main steps that they want you to remember for troubleshooting is that you should always gather information and identify what the symptoms are. Is it a hardware issue or software issue? Maybe you need to ask some questions from the person who's sending it if they're the only one that can't. But if your whole office cannot connect with the printer, then you probably are going to start at the printer side. Once you gather that data, review it and establish the most probable cause. And you might even have some backup ideas of what could go wrong here, meaning one of two or one of three things is the problem. So once you've decided which one is the most probable, test it out, see if that is the problem, and if not, move to your next idea. So here's a list of what are the most common symptoms or common issues in printers. And I won't go through every single one of them with you, but I'll take some time to go through how you can identify if this is the issue. So if you have a backed up print queue, which means you have a huge list of jobs, but nothing's coming out of the printer. The printer might literally just be out of paper or out of toner or whatever it needs, and it should be telling you on the printer screen what it's out of. If you think there's a paper jam, and sometimes it'll even tell you there's a paper jam, then just clear it and tell it it's ready to reset and it'll go. Pretty simple stuff. So if for some reason the printer is not printing the way you expect it, meaning that the characters are off or there's some page setup issues, meaning it thinks that it's printing on normal size, but you have legal size paper in there. Well, maybe you just need to check the drivers or make sure that the correct paper tray has been selected for that print job. If for any reason somebody is trying to access a network printer and there's no connectivity, they might not have access to that printer, meaning that they weren't involved in they're not placed digitally in the group that has access to it. They might need to be put into a certain group or be updated on group policy. They may need to be added to some type of access control list, an ACL, which we will definitely talk about more, so that they can access that printer resource. So it literally might just be that that individual's account is not on the list to be able to access the printer. If for some reason your print jobs never appear in the queue, well, you might have a network issue because people are sending the jobs over, but they're not making it to the printer at all. Either the user doesn't have those permissions, just like we just talked about with those access issues, and they probably got an error in that case, but there's other problems that can cause print jobs to never make it to a print queue. Network status of the client, meaning that somebody's laptop or computer is not on the network. Network status of the printer or the print server are not online, meaning they're not actually receiving the print requests. If there's insufficient space on your drive that is containing the spool folder, meaning that there's not enough room to actually save in that temporary space the print job before it sends to the hardware side, then you'll need to create some more space on wherever you have your print spooler within your print server. There's lots of sporadic problems that can happen, but I really want to concentrate on the ones that are specific to laser printers. So I want to take a look at if for any reason you have a smeared output, or you can touch the paper and the ink kind of rubs to the side. This is not supposed to be happening in a laser printer environment. This is not one of those inkjet printers where you have to blow on the page or give it a few seconds to dry. This should be dry when it comes out of the printer and ready to go. So one of two things is happening. Either the fuser temperature is not high enough and you need to turn it up, or if for any reason the toner is not fused, it could be that the pressure roller is not actually applying enough pressure. So you're going to have some instructions based on your manufacturer, or again, if it's under warranty, you can have somebody come out and take a look at that for you. If for any reason you have repeating horizontal lines, or the other way, you have white space on your paper, meaning that the toner or ink didn't make it to the paper, you probably have a dirty fuser roller, which means it's not getting cleaned properly, or there might be some type of debris between the white blade and the drum. Maybe a little piece of paper or something got stuck there. So you want to go in and clean all the fuser rollers and make sure that the distance between the repetitions of the lines are even, per se. So that means that you've cleaned all the debris out and they're able to make a consistent connection from that white blade to the drum itself. That means you need to clean the whole drum. And again, make sure anytime you do this, you're following whatever the manufacturer's instructions are or reaching out to a professional. Well, that's about it for the laser print process, and I want to make sure you're comfortable with it. So this is usually the video where people come back and watch certain sections. Again, networked printers. Pretty big on some of our students' practice exams and real exams, but definitely big for those of you who are going to enter into an enterprise or larger business environment. If you happen to be the guy or girl who will be working on printers, you're going to come across network printers, and they will probably be laser printers. So get used to it. Don't fight it too hard. They're not that bad once you get into the flow of it, but I don't want you to fret. Are you ready for a quiz? It is coming up here very soon. That is the next thing you should be doing. And we'll see you with that here in just a few seconds.